We'll get the screen shared here and we'll just roll with that. All right, are we seeing a maximum screen, everybody? We looking good? All right. And so I'd like to thank y'all for inviting me to come give a talk today. It's really an honor to be asked based on the assessment work that I did over the last couple of years. When we're doing this type of work, you don't really think about sometimes what other folks are doing or how some of their insights might have been able to help. I can tell you, I wish I'd have known where these videos were, or there would have been videos there when I got drafted to become the graduate curriculum chair years ago, because I think it would have been really, really helpful over the years, having talked with folks on campus and been a back and forth with the Office of Assessment. It's obvious that there's a real push toward us getting better and better at assessment, but also getting better and better, right? So that's the purpose of assessment for us, is to track what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and to make those corrections where we're able to find them. And so, again, my name is Dr. Christopher Craig. I'm over in the College of Business. I'm a professor of business over there. And some of the reasons why they may have invited me today, I don't know if this is it or not, but I have been an NSF principal investigator in years past. I like to tell this story because I came out of college as a business professor, and I had no idea what instructional design was. I'd never heard of the word assessment. I'd never heard of Bloom's taxonomy. I'd never heard of a lot of these things. And so I was working with the group, and we put up a grant, and come to find out the federal government is pretty strict about the goals and objectives, you evaluating those when they're going to give you lots and lots lots and lots of funds to do that work. And so I learned from colleagues at the University of Arkansas, the Rand Corporation, worked with some of their education staff on this grant project that spanned about 4 years there. Now, one of the areas where I'm particularly authoritative, I suppose, is teaching cases. And so I've published, and this dates back to the NSF grant too. We were teaching new curriculum where we brought STEM into business. And so the content wasn't there, so the materials weren't there. So we had to develop a lot of this. But I had 22 teaching cases. These are peer-reviewed teaching cases. Based on an NSF grant and research that was conducted at Murray State, we have 7 instructional design studies, including one about an MBA class. And so I worked with Dr. Carabas from the marketing department last year, and we published in the International Journal of Management Education about integrating sustainability science into MBA curriculum and assessing that, not only assessing the quantitative side, but also the effective side. And so we were tracking learning in terms of cognitive thinking, as well as affective or emotional attachment to the curriculum. And so I've looked at those indirect type measures and scholarship I've done. I've also integrated that into some other things I've done in the past with assessment here at Murray State. I am the editor-in-chief of the Case Journal. I don't know if anyone's into classroom or teaching cases, but we just got ABDC listed as C. So this was a big deal for us. And the Case Journal teaches full-length classroom cases, usually on the topics of business or some topic, I guess, connected to business or organizational decisions. It also has a full-length teaching note. And so last year, I think I saw 400 teaching cases come through my desk. And so I saw 400 sets of learning objectives. So these are things that I get to see a lot. These are things I get to see a lot and interact with folks from all over the world in terms of those teaching notes. Now, that's going to be more specific to a class than a program, but it's done kind of on a comparable trajectory, just a lower scale, I guess you could say. One of the things that has stemmed from the working with the Case Journal, as well as my work in instructional design publications, is I am launching a new journal with Emerald called STEM Education, Teaching, and Learning. And so hopefully this could be something of interest to everyone on the call, because it is explicitly interdisciplinary. And so anything teaching and learning, I'm a business guy. I wrote it in there to allow business folks, as well as social sciences, if they're taking the interdisciplinary approach to integrating STEM into their own curriculum, this could be a forum for them, as well as the more traditional STEM disciplines. And in terms of, why I was here, it's probably, I know it has to do with the reports that were filed and the manner in which those were filed. while I served as GIBCAC chair from 2022 to 2025. And I'll put Bloom's revised taxonomy up there. Hopefully, on an assessment talk, most of us have heard of this and seen it, though I do reference it from time to time and the different levels of thinking that are targeted with these different Bloom verbs. So we'll just go ahead and jump on in here. And so the talk is going to focus on the ADDIE model of instructional design. It's comparable to other models of instructional design that folks used. I picked this up through colleagues at RAND on that first grant project. So this is kind of what I've become familiar with and what I've stuck with. And so this is what I applied to assessment over at the College of Business on the MBA side. And so this is what I'll share with y'all today. We're going to start with strategic planning because that is an integral part of assessment and having our objectives as well as our measurements and what we're doing in the classroom be able to link back to those strategic directions that our leadership has provided for us. Not completely into ADDIE, so we'll look at measures, we'll look at targets if we have those versus not having those, how to deal with that. Then we'll look for gaps within the analysis, go through the design phase, curriculum matching, as well as making any alterations that you may need to learning objectives or provide some guidance on how to take those learning objectives that we have at a programmatic level and integrate those into the classroom as module level or course level learning objectives. Going to look at my approaches and different approaches that I would consider to be good ones for the development of curriculum materials, whether this is through the creation or adaptation. Talk about, some more assessment here, pre-test. Talk about implementing, post-testing, and determining through evaluation whether or not we met our targets and we're ready to write those results up and communicate them, or if we need to go back based on some gaps that we found in evaluation and head back over to design and development. So to start with the strategic planning, the first place that I've gone, and I'll share some experiences with y'all. I've never been in the rooms when a mission or a vision was crafted, but I have worked on different committees and worked with folks from a few different disciplines, I would say, to take this mission and to take our vision, which is to become a top regional business school in the United States, and consider what goals and objectives might be able to reach those. And so going through the mission, looking for areas, I'm looking for areas that may be measurable, looking for areas where we might can craft some learning objectives to target those and then go through the assessment process. And so business school, we want to graduate those with practical skills as well as intellectual skills. Looking down through the rest here, ever-changing landscape, that's one that I kind of interpret as we need to be adaptive. And so we do want to see in terms of our assessment, how we can progress and how we are getting better with our curriculum. And that can speak to that ever-changing professional landscape. And so within your reports, that is something that could be reported. But I'm thinking when I go back to the strategic management perspective, and this is kind of how we look at it in strategy, is that we have our missions. This is what we do uniquely well. We have our visions, which is aspirational and where we want to go. Then we have, our goals, and we can have multiple objectives within a goal. And so this kind of fits within assessment as well, that we have our mission. We should strive to hopefully link our goals back to the mission or vision where we aspire to be, or that are consistent with our institutional values or our institutional culture. Targets aren't up here, so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And so when I'm thinking, I'm thinking about how are we going to take this mission and operationalize it. And so as we operationalize it, the first thing we need to do is have a goal. We have a goal which can be to either will or do goals. And so what we came up with is students will have core business knowledge. And so the learning objective we had was to perform above a benchmark on standardized tests. Performance is going to be a third level of Bloom's. But as I was going through this, and I was the one that led this initiative a couple of years ago, one of the things that jumped out at me is, hey, we aren't really focusing too much on the vision. And one of the things that we have over here is a pretty aspirational vision that we do aspire to be one of the better regional business schools. And so, but we don't have any learning objectives or any measurements that are tied to that. And so just one of the takeaways that hopefully will come from the meeting for the business folks is that, we do have an opportunity to take and assess ourselves against some of the regional business schools in that aspirational state. And so we have our goals and objectives here. This is one of our primary goals, Okay, and just the framework of how they all kind of run in there together. Now, moving on to measures, oftentimes measures are selected within the analysis phase of the ADDIE model, but all of our programs are most likely going to have some measurements as well as learning objectives that come with them. And so to give some, I guess, some background on my experience, I came into assessment in the middle of cycles and I left in the middle of cycles. And so ideally it would be clean, right? And we could start, we could start fresh. But sometimes we have to be a bit more reactive to catch the problems that may have legacy found their way through. And so one of the first things once I'm looking at mission and vision as I start thinking about how to operationalize it. And so within our process, we took our learning objectives, we simplified those down using singular verbs, using singular objects, and we had a pretty good idea at that point on how we were going to assess based on our instruments that worked the previous cycle and also the instruments that did not work the previous cycle. And so I kind of rolled the ADDIE all into one as we're rolling through it as we're getting this fresh cycle started. And so, in terms of present, you saw this goal and objective in the previous slide. The students will have core business knowledge, and our objective there is to perform above a benchmark on a standardized test. And the target that we set for ourselves on this is 80%. And so this is one that had to be developed, and the way that this was developed was working with the core business faculty to essentially write a 10-question core disciplinary. This is a disciplinary. These are 10 of the things that are most important to this discipline. And then we put those into a shared assessment. And then we were able to look at two different things, and two of the targets that we had for this particular LO were to score above 80% on the standardized test on the aggregate, and also to score over 80% on each of the disciplinary areas. And so we did have two targets tied to the one objective. One of the other things, and this is something I haven't been a part of, I do know that programs have gone to where they're assessing more of the tracks and the minors and things. And so one of the ideas that I had way back when we were putting together this aggregated test was that these disciplinary questions could be repurposed within those programs and tracks. And so that would be an easy way to take work that we've already done and take that. I know with those additional tracks has created some workload for some folks, and that may be one way to kind of standardize that and have a measurement instrument that you can deploy relatively easily and is easy to interpret. Now down to goal five, we did add a goal and objective related to sustainability this term. One of the goals that went away, one of the goals and objectives that went away was international business. And the logic behind this is the last two cycles, we've scored well above the targets on international business. It has been effectively integrated into our curriculum throughout. And so at that time, we're looking to get better and evolve with the workforce, evolve with, in particular, the business accreditor, AACSB, on some of their goals and objectives they're moving forward. So we did draft a goal and objective related to sustainability. And so this doesn't follow my advice. Right? So we have evaluate, which is a fifth level verb, and then we have economic, environmental, and social dimensions. It's three different objects, but I'm familiar with the Zwickle et al. Scale. I know that it captures each of those sustainability elements. We've written about it. And so we were comfortable going with this measure, knowing that it's a holistic measure that measures all these things in the aggregate. And so this is kind of not following my advice per se, but if you do have to use multiple objects, make sure that you have those multiple measures or a measure that can capture the aggregate on those. Now to the new objective that I proposed, right? And so what are you gonna ask us to do, or what are you gonna suggest to do with the new objective that you propose? And one of the ideas was to use the ETS major field test again. We've used this in the past. It's rather clunky. So for those who haven't used these tests, you have to have someone to sit on the computer and click them in. You've got restrained windows and when students can enter. They're expensive. Not all students take them. Some students click through. And so there are some issues with the test, using it more formatively within the evaluation. That's one of the reasons that I really like having the MBA draft draft our own assessment because we can look at the specific items. We have granularity at this point, in that even if we are scoring 80%, maybe there's 3 or 4 questions these students aren't getting, and we can target those. That's exactly what we did working with, or what I did working with Dr. Keller a few years back on the SACS assessment, where we assessed sustainability in his class. Students scored over 80%, but there were some items, specific questions where they didn't do too well. And so one of the gap closing measures that went away is to specifically target those questions within a lecture. And so that was relatively easy to do. That wasn't very onerous on Dr. Keller, but using these assessments where we're not just getting an aggregated score and we can look at the individual items, it does allow us a little bit more pinpoint accuracy when addressing those closing the loop needs. One of the other things, and this is back to 2021, one of the efforts we undertook was to clean up the goals to be will be statements. So we don't want to have goals competing. We don't want to have goals competing with Bloom's verbs with our objectives. And so the previous goal was a first level. So identify and recall are both first level, but then you have a LO, which is going to be a third level. And so that's not technically how that would work anyhow. And so you don't want to have a higher level at the goal if you're going to include the verbs from both. But if you don't have the measures, create, validate, that's part of the analysis stage we're going to get to next. We use quantitative measures. So for 3 of our objectives, we had survey instruments that were created. We also had students read a test, rather read a case study and respond to that in written form. And so this allowed us to assess our two other goals related to decision-making and written communication. And so again, it's the overlap of these instruments that allows you to gather data in such a way where you're not having to do redundant work. Within that, I'm talking about the AACSB, although I have used written assignments in the past for SACS. Moving forward, ideally, we'll be doing the same, using the same objectives. I know that those were put into SACS at the first round, so we had the same objectives, and those measures are out there, which hopefully they can be used to streamline some of those processes. All right, and so moving to analysis. Analysis is where we're going to find the gaps. So gap analysis is where you would choose your measures. I want those to be aligned with LOs. This is where you can also figure out if measures are working very good or not. I use analysis to capture baseline. So this can kind of be used like as your pretest, depending on which type of assessment you're working on. But we're going to choose our measures. We're going to capture a baseline. We're going to capture whether or not our instrument works well or not. And so one of the observations that we had during the analysis stage when we were collecting this baseline for the MBA program was that some questions were marked wrong. So there were some questions that were missing answers. And so we had to go through and really rectify the questions that students were getting well below 50% on, and determine whether they were bad questions or whether there was some type of human error introduced. And so that's one of the things the analysis stage allows you to do. You can refine your instrument. During analysis, you can also capture those previous cycle gaps. I was talking about the international goal and how that went away based on us doing very well over the past 2 cycles. But if you did have persistent gaps that go from one cycle into the other, you would want to consider those within gap 2 and make sure you're addressing those. One of the goals that we were deficient on some of the areas in the past cycle, at least the AACSB cycle, was in our ethics category. And so that's one of the areas we focused on, and we have integrated some curriculum, I know, into Dr. Carabas's class through SACS, and there have been some other efforts made since. And so we want to find the gaps, and then once we find the gaps, we want to craft gap-oriented. We want to design gap-oriented curriculum, and so this can be a curricular map. This can be redesigning or designing your learning objectives. This could be designing your course level learning objectives. And so just if we take a look at our CAM here and just looking through our objectives, sustainability is new for us. And so it's not too terribly surprising that we don't necessarily have more coverage in the program. I expect as the world evolves and our teaching evolves that we will see more coverage on that area. And there's also some inconsistencies where we're seeing introduce, reinforce versus mastery in here. And so just some of the sequencing of where the content would want to go into the curriculum are probably some issues that might come up along the way. But in terms of our goals here, and these are the goals crafted for the latest AACSB cycle, and these were also entered and adapted into SACS. Perform above a benchmark, that's third level, analyze fourth level, demonstrate professional written communication third, determine if a business decision is ethical, and then on sustainability, we go to fifth. And the logic behind this is we don't want to move beyond where we've been in the previous cycles too terribly fast. And so during the last cycle, for instance, the goal had verbs at the understanding level. And so if we go up to this third level verb, and then you can fill in within your classes and those lower level verbs to get toward that. And so we are progressing to higher levels. I think it's justified based on success, how well we did on SACS and AACSB, the last cycles we reaffirmed for us to get a little bit more aggressive. And I would hope at the business college, now that I've stepped away from assessment activities, though, I'd hope we could continue this progression and become even more and more sophisticated, where we can go to the higher levels, even more so within our program level learning objectives here. So anything else on that? So now we've got our map here. One of the other statement I do want to make during the design phase, it is really, really, really smart, and it's going to come around on my last slide, to go ahead and map all your activities out from beginning to the end of the cycles. Kind of like the diagram I've gotten down there. When I've done this in the past, that's always had dates on it. That's always had dates on it to make sure that we're making progress. And everyone that's involved really knows the progression of where we're going. And so dates are very, very important. Another comment I can make about the diagram down there is that it can be used at a programmatic level for regional or for disciplinary purposes. And so, for instance, for SACS, we can start at ADDIE and run through this within every year, right? And so we have to evaluate the classes every year, and so you can use it for that. Or this can be used over 5 or 6 years. We're on a 6-year cycle now for AACSB, where you don't have to necessarily assess a class or a couple classes on those objectives every single year. And so once we identify the gaps in analysis, then during the design, we make sure that we're designing curriculum that address those gaps. And then once we have that design in place, then you would go to create your gap-oriented materials. These can either be developed, so original materials. I mentioned earlier, one of the things I really like to do and work a lot in is case studies. And so I'll write case studies for the purposes of my own class. The decision-making and written communication assessment tool was a case study that I wrote. And so I write them for all different reasons. This is more common in business schools, but teaching cases could potentially be used in other disciplines as well. And so if you want to develop those own materials, that's great. One of the things I would encourage folks to do who are developing their own materials is think about maybe publishing those materials. Because if you're going to go through all the work, to develop these materials, and you're going to engage in assessment, you're going to be using a rigorous design for assessment here, and you're going to have adaptive curriculum, this is the type of stuff that people write about and publish on. And so back to that STEM education, teaching and learning, this is the type of content that I'm telling people to bring me, right? And so we're all going through assessment. We're addressing these curricular gaps through doing things they're very novel and very innovative. And so when we're doing that, we can also get additional credit within our research stream. So I would encourage y'all, if you haven't thought about this, to think about that, and to feel free if you want to set up a chat with me at a later time on how we can repurpose assessment from your program into maybe publications. I'd be more than happy to talk with anyone on the call or that happens to listen to this after the fact. And so development, we've got those original materials or adaptations. This can be an article, this can be teaching cases, this can be a textbook. I mentioned earlier, Dr. Keller added documentation, um, added documented changes to his lectures. And so that was enough to overcome the gap we identified with the sustainability learning in his class based on those couple of measures there. And whether it's development or adaptation, then you would also want to think about how to use course level learning objectives going down the Bloom's level, um, from higher to lower, to integrate that into your class. That's within our modules. Most of us are doing that anyway already. And one of the examples that I have, and this was SACS a couple years ago, we assessed, using a first of the term and end of the term design. We assessed using an ethics survey. So 10 questions, or I think 9 or 10 questions on an ethics survey. And we worked relatively quickly to go from those results to identify the gaps in the areas, and then to actually draft a case study into the class that very semester before we collected data again. And so that was moving pretty quickly within the same term. This isn't very common, and it's not. It can be kind of onerous if you try to do this all in one term. And so I don't know if I necessarily suggest doing that unless you do have unless you have a sound system, and a really well-oiled process in place to make that happen every year. But that stayed within the curriculum for a while. And so, again, one of the things that we can do, and one of the most high impact things that professors can do is develop our own materials to make a real impact on this deficiency in students, really irrespective of what discipline we have. So, again, if you haven't delved into developing your own materials, and trying to get those published, I would highly encourage you to do so. And so pre and post tests, they don't necessarily have their own slide here, but I did want to kind of explain some of the different terminologies. So the analysis can, for all intents and purposes for SACS, serve as your pretest. That's going to be the first test that you have. There's not really any necessary need to do a pre and post test the next term. I suppose you could. So you could do maybe a baseline assessment within the analysis stage to identify gaps. And then you could develop those curriculum materials based on the gaps you identified, deploy it the next semester with the pre and post test around the intervention in that class. And so you get the baseline, you develop the curricular content based on it. You would pre-test before implementing, and then you would post-test after it. And so in terms of evaluation studies, oftentimes you'll want to see the pre and post test. I do not suspect if you're assessing at the end of the term. So if we're just adhering to the needs of assessment, where we have maybe we're getting a baseline, and then maybe we're getting a summative assessment as students are leaving our programs, that's probably not going to be methodological rigorous enough to make it to the journals. But if you pre and post test, and also if you're able to use counterfactual students, that's another thing that can amplify your opportunities to use assessment to get in journals. What I mean by counterfactual students, another term I learned through RAND, these are students as comparable as possible to the ones taking our intervention, but they're not control. We can't have control oftentimes in educational environments because students aren't able to select into classrooms where we're giving an intervention to one and we're not giving an intervention in the other. And so if you do pre and post tests, you can get a baseline compared to each other. Then you have the curriculum taught in one class, not taught in the other. And then you take the post test. You'd see if that counterfactual class moved significantly or not. And then you would see what happened with your control or treatment class rather. You'd hopefully see, and you usually do see when you take this approach, significant movement in knowledge. If you go to these great lengths to design it in such a way, it usually works out. But pre-test, again, not necessarily for SACS. You may want to for some reasons, but you don't necessarily have to in terms, at least of what I've seen or heard about assessment for accreditation purposes. We can do this at the end of the classes and make sure we get those interventions in there and document it. So it doesn't have to be quite as rigorous, but this is part of my process. So I did want to share. And then I'm going to cover the last three steps here before closing the loop. Implement, where we actually teach those things. And so if you are wanting to conduct pre and post tests, make sure you don't give it away to the students first. And so if maybe you want to cover a topic on the first day of class, maybe assess your students the first day and cover that topic on the second day. Um, this is one of the things I've had to do. It's really difficult to do when you're teaching on topics that you like and you want to introduce that first day of class. But to protect your assessment, you really want to keep that until the second day and get your assessment if you can. But this is where we implement. You can have other types of qualitative evaluation. I know in the National Science Foundation grant, one of the things that we did was we had classroom visits. We had observations. We were collecting relics. So ANC work is another thing that we collected. And it's a great practice for assessment. Um, Interviews with instructors. Get as complicated as we want to if you're involved with the grant. Don't want to do all those things here, clearly, because that's a lot of layers of work added on to us. But there are a lot of different qualitative and quantitative paths that can be taken, not necessarily even the things that any of us are doing now. After you would implement, you would post-test, you'd run the analysis on that. And based on analysis, you can see if your target was met. And then if your targets aren't met, you could go back up to your design and your development, and because this is going to identify the gap just like the analysis would. I don't know if it's going to be in the design. Maybe we have some issues with the learning objectives. Maybe, our measures aren't matched with the learning objectives and the professor isn't teaching this in the class. Maybe the materials weren't explicitly addressing the learning objectives. And so that's why you go back here. And that is another reason why I would encourage instructors to also think about when you're developing or adapting the materials into your own classroom, to do it in a meaningful manner that uses learning objectives that are really building off the program learning objectives. So we have that. We have implementation, post-test, evaluation. If our targets aren't met, if we go there, the loop is closed and we can communicate those results. Within SACS at the College of Business, I write up a report for whoever I've worked with, outlining everything about the assessment, how it was all done, and talking about the intervention that took place. And so we were putting interventions into place, and how to put that into the schedule to ensure the sustainability of that intervention at least throughout the accreditation cycle. And so that's another thing you'll want to consider when you're looking at these interventions to go into class. When you specifically identify a gap, that you want to make sure that there are processes put in place. I don't know if this is going through quality formally or departmental processes, but you don't want those interventions to get pulled out by the folks teaching in those core classes, at least not during the same accreditation cycle. And so some concluding takeaways. We're coming right up at 35 minutes. And so I'll wrap up and get to questions here. Use last cycle as a start, not as a template. There are a lot of legacy issues that I've found in the undergraduate side, just doing assessment and strategic management, our capstone class. There's a lot of legacy stuff and conversations that I've had that came from 10 or 20 years ago, right? And so use it as a start point, not as a template. Just because this learning objective was there last time doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it was measured correctly, and it doesn't mean it's linked to your curriculum. And so that's one of the first things that I learned. Improve from cycle to cycle. I think that's another really keen takeaway that I had kind of straddling the cycles. And take where you had that last cycle and elevate it, make it better, make it more sophisticated, and let's push our students toward our mission and our vision a little bit more pointedly through the use of instructional design here. Assessment cycles overlap. When I was in this position in the first cycles, and those cycles kind of corresponded to about 2023. When I was in this for the first cycle, the measures, the objectives, nothing matched up. And so the SACS assessment did not even resemble the ACSB assessment. And so I got us through the cycle. I was very fortunate to have some very gracious faculty in the MBA program to help me with assessment and help me to quickly make some of these changes to get on track before we went up for full review for those cycles. But we were reaffirmed, so that did work well. That's why I say plan for the whole cycle, address gaps when you find them. That's what I was looking for. And so you're going to find gaps We are all going to find gaps, and just like me today, right? I was the one who led the process to create these goals and objectives. We voted on them. We had a bunch of eyes on them. They've been seen, they've been done, and I noticed something new today. I noticed something new today, and going through this presentation that hey, we're doing a good job of linking and assessing to our mission, but we really don't have anything at the College of Business, at least on the MBA side, that is clearly linked to the vision. And so that is an area I think there is some improvement. But it's one of the things. It may already be planned for because I do know that I do know in some of the transitionary talks we were trying to figure out what to do with the ETS and what to do with the standardized test, and so it very well could be this objective will be added and that the ETS will be used as a summative evaluation that we can compare to our peer institutions come the end of the cycle, which is going to go to 2029, I believe. Avoid multiple object LOs. And use one Bloom's word. I split these up. I was going to cover these two together. One of the biggest things I see with learning objectives, I mentioned this earlier, is that instructors will use multiple verbs. That makes it exceedingly difficult to assess. We call this double-barreled if you're doing social science research, and if I'm asking about A and B, and I can't use your response for both, so it's going to be convoluted. And so try to stick to one verb. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do have multiple objects, make sure that your measurements are going to be able to capture those multiple objects. And with that, I want to thank y'all for taking the time to listen to me. And I guess I'll stop sharing and open the floor. We have time for questions. No?
Well, just before question, we'll say a huge thanks to you, Dr. Craig. I think this was very, very, I don't know the adjective, but I guess we all learned a lot from what you shared.
Is it a good adjective or a bad adjective?
It's a very good adjective, trust me.
I caught
Yeah,
a lot
so
of things before.
questions,
Yeah. Thank you.
do
And
we
thank you
have
for having
questions?
me.
That we appreciate. We appreciate you doing this. Sometimes I like to say that if you don't have a question, sometimes if you have a disagreement, then you just send him an email, and then that way there will be no one there. But we
Yeah,
really
no,
appreciate
I'll
you.
answer. No, I'll respond. That's another
Yeah,
thing that comes with
really
being a
appreciate
journal
it.
editor.
Yeah, and
And I do
especially
want to make.
yeah, 1 minute, especially just on our end, especially I remember I listened throughout. I'm just gonna point out one of the areas you talked about, but it's not because it's at the end. That means I was listening at the end. But I listened throughout. One of the areas you talked about was using your the end of your assessment not as a template, right? It should be the end of the cycle, not as a template. It should be a start of looking at that cycle. How did we do? And just moving from there instead of saying, well, this is it. We just got to keep using this over and over. But I think that was really insightful when it came from you, and especially you been working with assessment for some time and learning that as you go along. That was just me looking at it. I was like, wow, I can learn from this too. So thank you for sharing that.
And I don't know if there's any comments there, that questions in there. No. Yeah, and it's the point I want to make is I'm open to follow up or meet or on any of these issues with anybody here on campus, and I can be a resource, not only in assessment, like I said, but it's there's overlap, with other parts of our job functions as well, and I'm talking about reusing things for assessment. Also, we can reuse things for other job requirements to make our lives a lot easier. And so, if anyone is interested in anything I talked about at all. Assessment, research, et cetera, just please let me know. I'm here to help.
Well,
Yes, I just want to say thank you first for doing this, Dr. Craig, taking the time to present at our learning series, and for so generously sharing your published research and your department's assessment process with our colleagues. This is really extremely helpful. We really appreciate your time. And for those who are tuning in, we are going to share the slides if we get it from Dr. Craig. And then this video also will be uploaded in our YouTube channel.
Yes, so I'm going to stop the share just before we leave. I mean, stop the recording, sorry.